Have you ever watched someone reject a doctor, roll their eyes at a scientist, dismiss a therapist, and say something like, yeah, well, experts are wrong all the time, with the confidence of a man reviewing a 5-star toaster? And maybe, if we're being honest, you've done some version of that too. Not because you're irrational, not because you hate knowledge, but because something in you tightened up the moment an authority figure told you what was true, what was safe, what was best. And suddenly, instead of feeling informed, you felt managed, controlled, maybe even a little insulted. That reaction is more common than people think, and it's also much deeper than people realize. Because when people say they don't trust experts, they usually aren't just talking about information. They're talking about power. They're talking about identity. They're talking about memory. And sometimes, they're talking about pain. We tend to imagine trust as a clean, logical process. An expert studies something for 20 years, presents evidence, and then reasonable people nod and say, wonderful, thank you for your service. But the human brain is not a courtroom. It's more like a neighborhood. It remembers who embarrassed it. It remembers who talked down to it. It remembers which people sounded smart and still got things wrong. And once that neighborhood decides someone is not safe, it doesn't care how many degrees are framed on the wall. That's the first big thing to understand. Distrust of experts is rarely just about facts. It's about the emotional meaning attached to the person delivering those facts. Your brain is constantly asking questions beneath the surface. Is this person on my side? Are they trying to help me? Or are they trying to dominate me? Do they respect people like me? If I accept what they're saying, do I gain clarity? Or do I lose status? And that last one matters more than most people want to admit, because expertise creates a hierarchy. It quietly divides the room into those who know and those who don't. Even when experts are kind, the dynamic can still sting. If someone tells you they understand your body, your money, your child, your vote, or your future better than you do, that can trigger something ancient in a human mind. Not just insecurity, but resistance. Psychologists sometimes talk about reactance, which is the emotional pushback people feel when they sense their freedom is being threatened. Tell a teenager not to date that one person, and suddenly Romeo climbs through the window. Tell an adult, you need to stop doing this. And there's a weird part of the mind that says, actually, now I want to do it more. This doesn't happen because people are foolish. It happens because autonomy is precious. Your brain guards it like a dragon guards gold. So when an expert doesn't just inform you, but seems to corner you, a nervous system may stop hearing the message and start defending the self. The conversation shifts from, is this true, to who are you to tell me? And once that shift happens, facts have a very hard time getting in. But there's more. Distrust of experts also grows in the soil of contradiction. Experts do disagree. Science does update itself. Public guidance changes. One decade coffee is suspicious. The next decade, it's practically a personality trait. One headline says eggs are dangerous. Another says eggs are protein royalty. If you're an ordinary person juggling bills, family, stress, and about 40 browser tabs in your head, that can feel less like the refinement of knowledge and more like these people keep changing the rules. And here's where psychology gets interesting. Experts often see changing conclusions as a sign of honesty. It means the evidence improved. But to a lot of people, it feels like instability. Human beings like certainty. We don't just prefer it, we cling to it. Certainty calms the nervous system. It makes the world feel holdable. So when expertise sounds provisional, cautious, or nuanced, it can lose a bizarre battle against the person online who says something wildly oversimplified with absolute confidence. Because confidence is persuasive, not always correct, just persuasive. Your brain often reads confidence as competence, even when it shouldn't. That's why the loudest person in the room can sometimes sound more believable than the most informed. The calm expert saying, well, the evidence suggests several interacting factors, is technically responsible. The charismatic stranger saying, they're lying to you, and here's the real reason, is psychologically intoxicating. Why? Because simple stories reduce anxiety. Conspiracy, certainty, and suspicion can feel emotionally cleaner than complexity. Complexity demands patience. It demands intellectual humility. It asks you to live with partial answers. And honestly, who wakes up on a Tuesday excited about nuance? Then there's identity, which may be the biggest force of all. People don't evaluate information in a vacuum. They evaluate it through the lens of who they are, where they belong, and what their group believes. If accepting expert advice would make you feel disloyal to your family, your political tribe, your culture, your community, or even just your own past self, then rejecting that advice can feel less like ignorance and more like self-preservation. This is sometimes called identity protective cognition, and it's one of the mind's sneakiest habits. We don't merely ask, Is this claim true? We also ask, usually without realizing it, what happens to my sense of self if this is true? If the answer is embarrassment, shame, exile, or loss of belonging, then the brain starts building defenses at impressive speed. Suddenly, you're not just disagreeing with an expert, you're protecting your world. And sometimes that protection makes sense. Because let's be fair here, institutions have betrayed people before. Experts have been wrong before. Entire systems have ignored communities, underestimated pain, misdiagnosed suffering, and wrapped arrogance in professional language. For many people, distrust is not some random glitch. It's inherited wisdom. It's the echo of family stories that say, be careful. The official answer is not always the human answer. Think about someone who has repeatedly felt dismissed by authority, a patient whose symptoms were minimized, a worker talked down to by specialists, a community that experienced policies made by people who never had to live with the consequences. If you've lived through that, then trust the experts may not sound like reassurance. It may sound like a demand to forget. So no, the psychology here is not just stubbornness. Sometimes it's bruised pattern recognition, the brain saying, I have seen polished confidence before, and it did not protect me. At the same time, distrust can become its own trap, because once suspicion hardens into identity, every mistake an expert makes becomes proof, while every success becomes invisible. The mind starts collecting confirming evidence like a lawyer building one side of the case. This is confirmation bias, of course, but in everyday life it feels less like bias and more like common sense. You notice what supports your fear. You scroll past what challenges it. You remember the one prediction that failed and forget the 1,000 things expertise gets quietly right, like bridges standing, planes landing, medicines working, and your phone somehow not exploding every time you send a voice note. There's also a hidden psychological reward in rejecting experts. It can make you feel powerful, not always smarter, exactly, but awake, independent, hard to fool. In a world where many people feel manipulated by advertising, politics, algorithms, and institutions, skepticism can feel like dignity, like armor. I'm not one of the sheep may sound dramatic, but beneath it is a very human longing, the need to believe you can still think for yourself. And that need is not the enemy. Blind obedience is not wisdom either. The real challenge is that the same instinct that protects you from manipulation can also make you allergic to guidance. It's like having an immune system so aggressive it starts attacking healthy tissue. The goal isn't to kill skepticism. The goal is to make it intelligent. Because healthy skepticism asks, what's the evidence? Unhealthy skepticism asks, how do I dismiss this before it threatens me? Healthy skepticism stays curious. Unhealthy skepticism performs certainty while pretending to be independent. One is open-minded with standards. The other is closed-minded in rebellious clothing. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of all this. Sometimes people don't distrust experts because they love truth. They distrust experts because truth, in that moment, feels socially expensive, emotionally threatening, or ego-bruising. Sometimes rejecting expertise is less about thinking critically and more about avoiding the vulnerable experience of being corrected, which, honestly, is a deeply human thing. Nobody enjoys feeling small. Nobody loves discovering that their confident opinion on a complicated issue had the structural integrity of wet cereal. But growth often begins right there, in that mildly humiliating moment where the self loosens its grip and makes room for reality. So what do we do with all this? Maybe we start by dropping the cartoon version of the problem. Not every expert is trustworthy. Not every skeptic is foolish. The human story is messier than that. Trust is not something people give because you showed your credentials. It's something they build when they feel respected, when complexity is explained without contempt, and when uncertainty is admitted without panic. And if you're someone who instinctively resists experts, maybe there's no need to shame yourself for that either. That resistance might be trying to protect something important in you, your autonomy, your dignity, your right not to be manipulated. That instinct has value. It just needs refinement. It needs the courage to ask not only, could they be wrong, but also, what if I'm resisting this for reasons that have nothing to do with evidence? That question changes everything, because now you're not surrendering your mind. You're actually using it. You're becoming the rare kind of person who can stay critical without becoming cynical, who can respect knowledge without worshiping authority, who can doubt without drifting into reflexive disbelief. And maybe that's the real maturity we're all stumbling toward. Not blind trust, not permanent suspicion, but a steadier, wiser relationship with truth. One where your brain doesn't have to choose between humility and self-respect. One where being informed doesn't feel like being controlled. One where you can look at expertise and say, I'll listen carefully, question honestly, and decide thoughtfully. Because in the end, the people who grow the most are not the ones who trust everything and not the ones who trust nothing. They're the ones who can notice their own defenses, smile at them a little, and keep listening anyway. And if this made you think of someone, maybe yourself, maybe that friend who says, do your research, like they're delivering a sacred prophecy from a garage podcast, then sit with that for a moment. Let it be reflective, not judgmental. And if you want, tell me in the comments, when do you think skepticism becomes wisdom? And when does it become fear wearing a clever disguise? If this kind of deep dive is your thing, stay close. There's a lot more going on in the human mind than most of us were ever taught to see.